I should just get over it, move on, and be happy for you, I said. To hell with it. Of course, it was easy for them to say that. After all, they weren't the ones who stabbed them in the back and shoved the person they loved more than anything else in the world down the stairs to the septic tank. It got to the point where I hated everyone around me. My principal, Mr. Smith, sent me to a psychologist, and it's a good thing he did. I was on the verge of doing something idiotic. She advised me to write down my feelings, which I did. The result was this book. Yolanda also advised you to start exercising, remember? Asked Mom, returning with the apple pie. She was probably eavesdropping and thought personal space was getting out of hand. Is that why you look so good now? Asked Daisy, hastily wiping her eyes with a napkin and hurrying to change the subject. I've never seen you in this shape before. Thank you, yes, I have. I've been doing martial arts and signed up for a fitness center. It's helped me a lot, I said, but still angry, Daisy remarked, even after all this time. It's much better now than it used to be, believe me, her mom assured her. 2 years ago, you wouldn't have even walked through the door, at least not on your feet, maybe on your head. I'm sorry, Mike, I really am. I knew it would hurt, but I didn't realize it would destroy you like this. That's why I gave you everything in the divorce. I thought it would help you move on. When you didn't fight back, I thought you'd be okay, Daisy said. To tell you the truth, my lawyer was shocked when he read your petition. He told me I had to sign it quickly before you changed your mind, I admitted. Have you dated anyone since then? Hesitantly asked Daisy. Not really, I replied curtly. A couple of drunken one-night stands, but that's about it. I don't even remember their names. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother's eyebrows rise to the ceiling and a look of utter disgust flash across her face. She bit her tongue to keep from telling me what she thought. I knew I'd find out later, but at that moment, I didn't care. Oh, God, Daisy sighed. I don't know what to say. I guess sorry won't be enough, will it? No, it wouldn't, I agreed sourly. We ate the pie in silence, but I could see the hurt on Daisy's face, and I didn't want to look at Mom's face. After we finished, we said goodbye, and Mom walked me to the door. I made sure Daisy couldn't hear what I was about to say. Are you sure you're doing the right thing, Mom? I asked. What about her family? Can't they help? I called her parents. They've moved to a nursing home in Florida and refused to talk to her. I got the same response from her sister. Will they do anything to help her? I asked. No, nothing, Mom said quietly. She doesn't have anyone, Mike. Nothing. What a truly screwed up family, I said, shaking my head. Then I looked at her. Even when I turned into a bitter old rascal, you didn't abandon me. You were there for me when I needed to be scraped off the sidewalk. You and Dad always said, family takes care of family. No argument here, Mom replied, with tears in her eyes. What are Daisy's chances really? I asked seriously. Mom looked back at Daisy before answering. I honestly don't know, Mike. They've made quite a bit of progress since I retired, and although I was a nurse, I've spent the last few years in accounting and administration. Still, I've seen people in better shape than her die, and I've seen people in worse shape survive. There's no way to tell, we'll just have to wait and see, she said, looking at me, neither hopeful nor angry. A lot of it comes down to wanting to live, to have something to live for. I ignored that. I'm worried about you, Mom. What if she does something behind your back? I know you don't trust her, and I understand. Thank you for your concern, but I don't think it's warranted. She literally has nothing and no one right now, and people who have nothing to lose, I said. Be careful. If you need anything, let me know. I will, Mom promised, but I don't think you have anything to worry about. I hope not, I said. Anyway, thanks for dinner. I'll be in touch. Love you. Love you too, son, she replied, kissing me on the cheek, and please, I know you hate her right now, and I understand, but she's nearing the end of her rope. Please try to keep your emotions in check. Don't cut the rope she has left to cling to, for her own sake. I'll try, Mom, I sighed heavily, consumed by the dull universal pain. That's all I ask, and I promise not to play matchmaker, thank you, I replied and smiled at her before walking away. The next 2 months flew by quickly. I tackled projects I wanted to do around the house when I wasn't preparing for the new class coming to school. Classes were due at the end of August, and I promised myself at least a week off before class. On Fridays, I had dinner at my mom's house. I saw the effects of Daisy's chemotherapy, which was making her weaker and sicker. I thought the treatment was supposed to make the patient better, but apparently, that's not how cancer is treated in all cases. By mid-August, she had lost all her hair and was wearing a stylish bamboo chemo cap. My feelings for her didn't change, but I learned to be polite to her, which seemed to make her feel better. It was more for Mom's peace of mind than anything else. Daisy also started getting money deducted from Bruce's paycheck. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Daisy opened a checking account at the local bank, and Mom made sure the money went into it. Daisy insisted that Mom keep some of the money to offset the cost of food and electricity. Eventually, Mom agreed and kept 10%, which she put in a small box. I figured that this money would go to cover funeral expenses if and when that happened. On the Friday before school started, I drove to my mom's house as usual and saw an old beat-up Toyota parked on the curb in front of her house. I saw the Wisconsin license plates and was suddenly overcome with a terrible feeling. I parked in the driveway and walked into the house. As usual, Mom was sitting on the couch, and Daisy was lying in a chair covered with a blanket. I heard a noise from the kitchen, then saw Mom's cell phone in her hand and hoped she had called 911. They both looked scared, and I realized why when Bruce came in from the kitchen with a can of soda and a partially eaten sandwich. The part of my mind I'd learned to keep on a short leash grinned like a wolfhound with a growl that originated deep in my gut. He was still over 6 foot tall, but his once commanding presence was gone. He now looked ungroomed, his hair was uncombed, and his face was covered with 2 days' worth of stubble. He was still trim, but no longer as trim as he had been 10 years ago. Instead of an expensive suit, he was wearing dirty jeans and an equally dirty denim shirt with the collar unbuttoned. Well, if it isn't the teacher, Bruce snorted haughtily. My hatred for this man had reached a critical point. I'd never been in a real fight in my entire life, but I'd learned a lot from sparring in martial arts. One of the first things I learned was to avoid fighting if at all possible. Even if you win, the consequences can haunt you for life. What do you want, Bruce? I asked coldly. I want the money that you stole from me, he growled. Stole? I was under the impression that you were court-ordered to provide a percentage of your net income for maintenance, I said. My tone was even, but my eyes were probably snake eyes. The difference is the same, they took my money, and I'm about to be evicted because I can't pay my rent, Bruce hissed. Thanks to her, you had enough money to drive here from Milwaukee, I reasoned. You could have used it to pay the rent. Don't me, little teacher. Maybe I should just kick your ass like I should have done 10 years ago. That was the only reason I didn't. She insisted that I treat you with respect for taking care of her all those years ago. Why don't you just leave? I said, slowly raising my hands, hoping to stop a potentially deadly confrontation that also set me up for 6 blocks and a few neat counter-punches, but he probably didn't realize that. Daisy is sick, she has cancer, and she needs all the help she can get. Cancer, huh? Is that her latest lie? Asked Bruce. He set aside his Coke and sandwich, then reached behind his back. When he brought his hand back, there was a revolver in it. I just so happen to have the cure for that, he added, pointing the weapon in Daisy's direction. Don't do that, Bruce, Mom pleaded, pointing to where she had placed her phone on the side table. The 911 operator was probably listening to the entire conversation. Please, I've already called the police, and they're on their way here. Mike is right, leave now, and nothing more will be said. I started to move to get between Bruce and Daisy, but he saw me and quickly pointed the gun at me. I could see the desperation in his eyes as he spoke. I forced myself to mentally back off. I hadn't come this far and survived this long to be randomly shot by a cop. Stay where you are, Teach. Don't move a single muscle, Bruce hissed as his hands began to shake. At that moment, we saw flashing red and blue lights through the windows in the front room and heard a voice over the speaker system. Mr. Williams, this is the police. The house is surrounded. We know you have a weapon. Put down your weapon and step outside with your hands in the air, the officer ordered. You better do as they say, I said to a wide-eyed Bruce. How do they know? I have a gun, asked Bruce. I told them I saw it stuffed in the back of your pants, said Mom, and Mike's right, you better do as they say. This is your last chance, Mr. Williams. Drop the gun and get out of the house, the officer commanded over the speaker microphone. Bruce looked around at the three of us, and I realized he was starting to get nervous. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw his determination disappear. If you were smart, you would have done what they said, I told him. You won't get a third warning. I heard the back door open, and suddenly 2 officers appeared in the room with their pistols at the ready, pointed at Bruce. Drop your weapons, ordered one of the officers. Bruce turned around, his eyes widening as he realized that 2 semi-automatic pistols were pointed at him. Foolishly, he raised his weapon, but the officers fired first. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard Daisy scream, and I was horrified at what I saw. By then, 2 more officers had entered the room through the front door, responding to the shooting. My mom lunged at Daisy and clutched the pride and joy anti-masser she had inherited from her grandmother. I had never been in a situation like this and froze, not knowing what to do. One of the officers saw Daisy and radioed for an ambulance. Another examined my mom and attended to her, applying pressure to the wound, while the first 2 officers knelt beside Bruce. I saw one of them shake his head and realized Bruce was dead. I was shaking. Part of me wanted to scream, the bastard is dead, and the other part of me resented that it had all happened too fast. Mom staggered back, and I grabbed her. She clung to me and trembled even more than I did. The other 2 officers were busy administering first aid to Daisy. I was giving my statement to an officer when an ambulance pulled up to the driveway. A detective arrived as well, with a team of crime scene investigators. While the detective took statements from me and my mom, one of the paramedics quickly determined that Bruce was dead. While he and the officer placed him in a body bag, the other 2 examined Daisy, placed her on a gurney, and wheeled her to the ambulance. I'm going with her, Mom insisted. However, the paramedics informed her that there was no room in the ambulance and suggested she follow. You can come with me, I told her. The detective informed us that the house was now a crime scene, so we would have to leave while they worked. He promised to lock up the house before he left and said they might need to talk to us later. Here's the name and number of a good cleaning service, the detective said, handing Mom a business card. She absent-mindedly accepted it, and we got into my car. As we drove to the hospital, my head was spinning. I wanted to deal with Bruce on my own, and I was glad he was dead, even if not by my hand. Strangely, I felt terrible about Daisy being hurt and hoped she would be okay. My emotions were mixed up, to say the least. We made it to the hospital and walked into the emergency room, where we were told that Daisy was being wheeled in for surgery. After arguing over the definition of next of kin and my mom showing Daisy's Medicaid paperwork and a form naming my mom as Daisy's medical proxy, the nurse behind the counter escorted us to the waiting area, where we sat for several hours. Finally, the doors opened, and a doctor approached us. Mrs. Carpenter, he asked. Yes, that's me, Mom replied. How's Daisy, Miss Williams? Stable and on the mend. I think she'll survive the gunshot wound. The bullet went through her but didn't hit anything vital. She's lucky, the doctor said. Another inch or 2 more to the left, and she wouldn't have survived. Thank God, Mom sighed. She's lost a lot of blood, and her weakened condition due to the cancer and chemotherapy isn't in her favor. However, we found something else and contacted her oncologist, the doctor added. Oh, what? Mom asked. I know she's undergoing chemotherapy, but we found what looks like traces of infection in her system. I've ordered a series of tests just in case." "Oh no," Mom sighed. "Is she going to be okay?" "It's too early to tell. She's under sedation at the moment. We'll keep her here for at least 3 days." "Can we see her?" asked Mom. "I don't think so, not until tomorrow morning at the earliest. Let me give you a card. You can call this number anytime to check on her progress and find out which room she will be in," he said, handing Mom the card. We left the hospital and drove back to Mom's house. We were both silent the whole way, but Mom cried most of the way. I was immersed in my own thoughts. I remembered telling Daisy about how I had fantasized about killing her and Bruce. Now she was lying in the hospital, fighting for her life. Surprisingly, I felt a little bad about it and did my best not to think about it. When we got back to her house, I saw that the crime scene tape had been ripped off and was lying in the trash can outside the house. There was a note on the door from the detective saying that the crime scene had been vacated. He had locked it up and given the key to the neighbor. Mama immediately set about cleaning it up. I saw the remains of the chair that Daisy had been sitting on when she was shot and took it to the car to take it to the dump. When I returned, my mom was on her knees wiping the blood off the floor, her tears dripping onto the floor, watering it almost as much as the bucket and rag. "Is there anything I can do to help?" I asked after standing silent for a while. "Thank you for asking, but no," she replied without looking up. "I've cleaned more than that." "Would you like to stay at my place tonight?" I asked. I knew our mom was strict, but everyone has their boundaries. "That won't be necessary," Mom replied, wiping her forehead with her forearm. "I'll be fine. Besides, I need to be here in case the hospital calls." I thought about it and shook my head. "In that case, I'll stay here." She looked up at me. Her words sounded like, "You don't have to, Mike," but there was a look of gratitude on her face. "I know, but I'm going to do it anyway. And if you intend to clean up on your own, I'll be helpful and make something to eat before we head to bed." I mimed a small crooked smile. "I hope the wine goes well with the scrambled eggs and bacon. I think we could both use a glass before we try to sleep after a day like today." She looked at me, shook her head, and grinned. "We'll see." But I noticed that as she went back to cleaning, she scrubbed more vigorously. I worried about nightmares, but either a glass of wine or emotional exhaustion had us sleeping like hibernating bears. In the morning, we fiddled around the house, barely speaking, until around 10 o'clock when the phone rang. I went into the kitchen so as not to eavesdrop. 5 minutes later, she joined me and said, "Daisy is still in serious condition, but her condition is stable. She's having a lot of tests done, but she should be back in her room by mid-afternoon." I nodded my head absent-mindedly, trying to see if I felt anything, but other than dazed and confused, I didn't catch anything. "Would you mind giving me a ride?" she asked, pulling me away from my introspection. "No problem," I told her. "What time can we be there?" "At 2:30. "Sure, I'll give you a ride." I left a little early to take an old chair to the dump, run some errands, and then followed my mom back to her house. From there, we drove to the hospital and got directions to Daisy's room. We went into the hospital gift store and bought a card, a vase of white carnations, which I knew were Daisy's favorite flowers, and an Agatha Christie novel, the same one she had read before she left me for Bruce. Mom looked at me cheerfully as I paid for everything. "What?" I asked defensively. "Oh, nothing," Mom said, shaking her head. I felt my face burn. "Don't get any ideas," I told her. "Yeah, you really care about her, don't you?" Mom asked. "No, not really. I just thought it would make her feel better, that's all." I double-checked my change to make sure the cashier hadn't ripped me off. "Sure," Mom replied in her typical manner. She patted my hand and said quietly, "Mike, the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. When hate dies, a bunch of emotions have nowhere to go. And it's okay that you still feel something worthy of the person you thought she was. And your secret is safe with me." After that, we went to Daisy's room. She was awake, but she looked like a wrung-out towel. Mom kissed her on the cheek and handed her the card. Her eyes lit up when I showed her the flowers. My favorites. You remembered, she exclaimed in surprise. Her voice was low and weak, but her tone was pleasant. Yes, I said, holding out the novel to her. As I recall, you read it when you left with Bruce, I added without emotion, though my gut twitched slightly. Yes, I did read it, and I never got a chance to finish it. Thank you, she said quietly, not looking at me and leafing through the paperback book. Any news? My mom asked. Not yet, Daisy replied with a shake of her head. She closed the paperback book but didn't let it out of her hands. Moreover, she snuggled into it like a teddy bear. They said I probably won't hear anything for at least a day. That's fine, Mom agreed. The nurse added, How are you feeling? Terrible, Daisy moaned. I'm exhausted. My whole side hurts, and my stomach hurts. They'll sort it all out, her mom reassured her. What about Bruce? Asked Daisy, still not looking at me. He was pronounced dead at the scene, Mom told her. Good, Daisy said firmly, finally showing some strength. I'm glad he's dead. A grim expression appeared on Mom's face, but she didn't say anything. She just patted Daisy's hand and nodded her head. I remained silent as the two women talked. Part of me was glad to hear that my ex-wife had turned against Bruce. Her statement helped diffuse the hatred I'd been holding back. But it wasn't enough to turn back the last 10 years. A nurse entered the room and looked at Daisy's vital signs. It's time for you to take your medication, Mrs. Williams, a young woman told Daisy as she handed her a cup of pills. Daisy took the medication and chugged it down with water. How are you feeling? Exhausted? Daisy sighed, and I'd prefer Daisy to Mrs. Williams if you don't mind. I can't pretend it didn't happen, but I can try to put it behind me. You could hear the weariness in her voice, but she mustered determination for the last part. I'll pass this on to the rest of the staff, the nurse said with a smile. Maybe it's time for you to get some rest, the nurse added. I assumed she was implying that it was time for us to leave. When will we know the results of her tests? Mom asked the nurse. Dr. Samuels is consulting with her oncologist, so they should know something definite by tomorrow morning, replied the nurse. You have our number, and we have yours. We said our goodbyes, and I noticed the wistful look on Daisy's face that she threw at me before leaving. I smiled weakly before closing the door. I dropped my mom off at her house and then headed home to finish up my weekend chores. The next morning, we met in Daisy's room at the hospital. Being a part-time volunteer at the hospital, Mom arrived a couple of hours before me. Shortly after me, 2 doctors entered the room. I met Dr. Samuels, the surgeon who operated on Daisy, and was introduced to Dr. Konakty, Daisy's oncologist. They tried to look professional and confident, but even I could tell they were worried. So, what's the word? I asked, hoping for good news despite their facial expressions. Miss Williams is suffering from a combination of peritonitis and diverticulitis, which explains some of the symptoms you've told us about in the past, Mrs. Carpenter. Dr. Samuels took up the report. Our scans have revealed several huge pockets of infection in Daisy's abdomen. In addition, we believe her gallbladder is punctured and will have to be removed. How did this happen? I asked, feeling Mom squeeze my hand tighter. There are probably several reasons, but we believe she had an underlying condition that was exacerbated by the cancer and the medications used in chemotherapy, Dr. Konakty replied. So, what happens now? Mom asked quietly. She will eventually need surgery to remove all the infection and repair the damage, but we'd like her body to recover some more from the surgery she just had. So, we're going to leave her here on antibiotics for the next couple of weeks and see if the infection diminishes. Of course, the chemotherapy will be suspended during that time, explained Dr. Samuels. What are her chances? I asked, trying to keep my tone even. The doctors looked at each other before answering. I didn't like the expressions on their faces. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, Dr. Samuels said without surety. She doesn't stand a chance. Her body is very delicately balanced right now. Giving her the highest possible doses of antibiotics will likely disrupt her metabolism and weaken her further, possibly even fatally. As far as we can tell, the dose she's on now has stopped the infection from spreading and is gradually pushing it back. But even if she clears up completely, the antibiotics won't repair the damage. There is no open perforation of the bowel wall, otherwise, we would be doing high-risk emergency surgery right now. But she was probably on the verge of perforation when we caught her, and the bowel wall is probably perforated in one or more places. Exploratory surgery to try to see what the machines can't show is almost as high risk. Now manipulating the coils of the intestine can literally tear open weakened areas and cause what we are trying to avoid. We need to clean the intestines of infections as much as possible and repair any damage when she is strong enough to tolerate surgery. Then she needs to get even stronger. I won't say she needs a healthy body, but she needs to be healthy enough before we try to fight the cancer again. The malnutrition she suffered from for months has dangerously weakened her entire body. She won't survive chemotherapy unless she clears out the infections and gets her other body systems working properly. Peritonitis on its own is life-threatening, and combined with cancer. He shrugged. The surgery itself is risky, Dr. Kincaid added. Very risky. We estimate that, given the level of infection in her abdomen and the damage to her internal organs, her chances of survival are between 30 and 40%. So, I have no chance without surgery, or less than with it. Is that what you're saying? Asked Daisy soberly. Her eyes were wide open, and I could see she was sweating, but her voice was steady. Yes, I'm afraid so, Dr. Kincaid confirmed. However, once you recover from the surgery, you should be able to undergo the chemotherapy without any problems. Then I guess we have no choice but to do the surgery, Daisy said weakly, sinking back onto the bed. Good, we'll make all the necessary arrangements, Dr. Samuel said. They left the room, and Daisy burst into tears. Her mom cradled her and comforted her. Don't worry, Daisy, you have the best doctors in the hospital on your side. Everything will be okay, she said as Daisy cried. I had a lot to get through, and I couldn't do it here. It was strange. Not long ago, I would have happily celebrated the news of Daisy's passing, but now my emotions were at a breaking point. Look, I have to go. School starts tomorrow, but I'll check in on you from time to time if you'd like, I offered. Yeah, I'd like that, Mike. Daisy exclaimed. Mom smiled, looking at me. We left the room, and I walked Mom to her car, waving to her as she drove off. I kept my promise and visited Daisy several times over the next 2 weeks. We talked about many things, my teaching, my students, my book, her failed marriage to Bruce, and our failed marriage. We also discussed our feelings and everything that had brought us to this point. During one of the visits, I broached the subject of her family. I'm curious about something, I said. What exactly? Asked Daisy. What's going on with your family? Why do they hate you so much? Mom called them, but they apparently want nothing to do with you. Remember when I told you they disowned me after the class action lawsuit was filed against US? Yes, I remember, I replied. What you don't know is that they knew about Bruce from the beginning. They promised to help keep you in the dark, and in return, Bruce promised to help support them when they retired. He even offered to buy my parents' cruise tickets when they retired. And you and your sister knew about all this? I asked, my anger starting to build. Daisy lowered her eyes in embarrassment. Yes, she whispered before looking at me again. It was another knife in the back. I know, and I'm so terribly sorry. So, your family used you and Bruce the same way you used me, I remarked. My tone wasn't cold, it was icy. She wrinkled her nose and just looked miserable. I controlled myself. If you don't want an answer, don't ask the question, I said coldly. Daisy admitted sorrowfully, things went downhill when we got sued. After we lost everything, my family wanted nothing to do with me. That explained the way they treated me after you left, I told her. It also explained how Daisy thought it was okay to use me while she waited for Bruce. Everyone had the upper hand except me. It also reinforced my belief that there was no way I could ever make up with her, not after everything she'd done. Daisy realized this too and made no effort to rekindle what I thought we once had. But we did manage to make up, and I saw sparks, flashes of the woman I had fallen in love with several times in the process. I found that my hatred for her and Bruce diminished considerably after his death. My hatred for Bruce faded a bit as well, though I still hoped that he would face severe eternal punishment for all he had done, and not just to me and Daisy. Mr. Smith allowed me to take the day off for Daisy's surgery and arranged for a substitute teacher. I arrived at the hospital early in the morning and talked to her before she was wheeled into the operating room. I was unaccountably worried but tried my best not to show it. "I know I've said a lot of nasty and hateful things since you've been back," I said, "and I just want to apologize for that. I really hope you can get through all of this." Part of me was surprised that I didn't have to pretend to be sincere. "Thank you, Mike, that means a lot to me," Daisy replied with a weak smile. "I deserved everything you said, so I accept your apology. And I want to apologize for destroying the best man I've ever known. I know it's too late for us, but I do love you. You put up with me when you had no reason to." She took a deep breath. "Please promise me something," she asked. "Whatever happens, I want you to find someone you love." "You deserve it," she said sincerely. That surprised me. She continued to look at me so intently that I finally said, "I promise I'll try." She nodded slightly, as if giving herself a little absolution. "We need to get her to the operating room, sir," the orderly said politely. "Of course," I said. "Just a minute." Completely spontaneously, I leaned over and kissed Daisy on the cheek. "You can do that," I said, as she smiled back. I froze in bewilderment for a moment. She looked exactly as I remembered her on our wedding day. Some deeply hidden part of me wondered if there were times when she really loved me and I wasn't just a provider for her. I stood up, a little dizzy, and the orderly wheeled her gurney out of the room. "That was really nice, Mike," Mom said softly. As we followed the orderly into the operating room, she was wheeled inside, and we sat down in the waiting room. We sat there for several hours while the surgery went on. I tried to watch the TV hanging on the wall, but I couldn't concentrate on what was being said. All I could think about were the events of the last 10 years. My mind endlessly replayed everything over and over again while my mom worked on her latest Afghan. I paced back and forth, drinking one cup of crappy coffee from the machine after another. I was caught in an endless loop, reliving the last few months all over again. 6 hours later, Dr. Samuels walked out of the operating room. The look on his face, I immediately didn't like. He approached us and asked us to join him in a small room. After closing the door behind us, he sat down at a small table across from us, rubbed his eyes, and sighed heavily. I thought he was going to burst into tears. Mom squeezed my hand so hard my fingers ached, and I knew what he was going to say before he even said it. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Carpenter, Mr. Carpenter. We did everything we could for Daisy. There was just too much infection and damage to her internal organs," he said sadly. "Her body just shut down. She signed a DNR and a form donating her body to cancer research if she didn't survive. Her heart stopped, and we did everything we could ethically, but we were never able to get it started again. I'm sorry for your loss." Mom immediately burst into tears, and I felt a tear about to burst from my eye, but I refused to shed it. I hugged my mom as she sobbed and nodded to the doctor. "Thank you for everything you've done," I told him. We shook hands, and I saw a tear leak out of his eye. When Mom calmed down, we walked back to Daisy's room in a near-trance-like state. We didn't say anything as we packed our things. There was no need to say anything. I found a small envelope labeled Mike in Daisy's handwriting in the drawer of her bedside table. I opened the envelope and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Daisy had written a note in case she didn't survive the surgery. "Mike," the letter began. "You will only see this in case I don't survive. Thank you for being there for me the last 2 months, especially the last 2 weeks. You don't owe me anything, but you and your mother were there for me when everyone else abandoned me. I know what I did to you 10 years ago is unforgivable, and I'm terribly sorry I hurt you. I want you to know that even after all this time, a huge part of me still loves you, and I'm sorry for what my infatuation with Bruce has put me through. I know you'll never feel the same way about me, and I understand you. I can only hope that through my death, you will finally find peace. Love, Daisy. The note ended. I began to shiver as I looked at the words on the paper. I saw the water droplets hit the note, and I realized I was crying. I felt my mom's hand on my shoulder. "What's wrong, son?" she asked. It was like a dam burst inside me, and I cried hot, bitter tears as I showed my mom the note. It was the first time I had cried since Dad had died 6 years ago. Mom started crying again after reading Daisy's note, and we ended up crying together, hugging each other. I realized something else when we calmed down enough to finish packing Daisy's things. All the anger, hatred, and bitterness I'd carried inside me for 10 years was gone completely. For the first time in 10 years, I felt calm. It was as if my hatred had died with Daisy, as if I'd gotten lost in a dark and barren maze, and her death had caused part of the wall to crumble and opened a way out for me. Strangely, her death healed me. We finished packing her things, signed the papers, and left the hospital in a daze. I followed my mom to her house and helped get Daisy's things inside. We had a gloomy dinner of leftovers, barely saying anything to each other. After I helped her put the dishes away, she left to go to her room, and when she came back, she held something out to me. I looked at what she gave me, a small picture of a smiling Daisy in her mom's chair. It had been taken shortly after the chemotherapy started. "I just thought you might like something to remember her by," Mom said. "Thanks," I said, hugging her. "By the way, do you want to call her family, or should I?" "Would you mind doing that?" she asked. I talked to them once, and that was all I could handle. "Sure," I said. "I'll call as soon as I get home." Mom handed me a slip of paper with the number on it, which I put in my pocket. We hugged one more time, and I left back home. I called Daisy's parents. Her father answered after the second ring. "Fred, it's Mike Carpenter," I said. "What do you want?" he asked angrily. As I considered my words, I wondered what had gotten into his underpants. After all, I wasn't the one who had turned down financial support and a retirement cruise. "Your daughter Daisy died in surgery today," I said. "I don't have a daughter named Daisy," Fred grumbled. "Not anymore you don't." "Why are you calling?" he asked. "I just thought you might be interested to know." "So what do you want from me?" asked Fred. "Do you want us to demand a body or something?" "No, she donated her body to cancer research," I said, barely restraining myself. "Well, at least her life wasn't wasted," he growled. "Don't call here again." I heard him curse before ending the call. I felt like calling back and ripping him to shreds, but I decided that would be a waste of time. Sighing, I called my principal at home and told him the news. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mike," he said. "How are you holding up?" "I've gotten better," I said, "but I'll be fine." "Look, why don't you take the rest of the week off, and I'll put it down as paid parental leave. I'll find a replacement." "Thanks, I really appreciate it," I said. We finished talking, and I grabbed a beer from the fridge. I opened the bottle and took a long look at the picture my mom had given me. "Here's to you, kid," I said, and took a big sip. Epilogue. The following June, I've never been comfortable in a cemetery, which is probably to be expected. The endless reminders of mortality can be depressing to someone with an ordinary imagination. I parked my car on the center path under the broad branches of an ancient maple tree and walked. The sun was shining brightly on the cemetery's main road, but as I drove into the ornate wrought iron gates, everything turned a kind of gray. It was one of those mysteries of life. I found the monument pretty quickly. It was small but much newer and cleaner than the surrounding stones. I sighed as I looked at it. I remembered the way my mom had looked at me when I filled out the form at the monument company. I didn't want to bury her under the last name Williams because I was sure my ex-wife would come back to haunt me. But the cemetery administration insisted on using the name Williams because that was what was listed on Daisy's death certificate. So that's the name that was used. So far, no ghosts have appeared. There was a small bronze flower tube next to the monument, and I placed the white carnation I had brought with me in it. The grass in the small plot was still no more than green fluff, and the soft earth had not yet had time to settle. When it was over, the medical school cremated Daisy's remains and returned them in a simple urn with a letter of thanks. Mom and I decided to bury her rather than scatter her ashes. After almost an entire bottle of wine, a few tears, and a few laughs, Bruce was buried in a neglected and unkempt far corner of the lot under a small concrete block topped with a bronze tag with a single serial number, a pauper's grave. I'd only visited it once, just after Daisy died. I poured a bottle of urine on the ground right where I calculated his face should have been. If anyone saw me urinating on him, I might have to explain myself. After a few minutes of silent reflection, I muttered my goodbye. I had shed all the tears last week when Mom and I were the only ones present at her burial. Despite turning to Daisy's family and so-called friends, I guess I figured that if Jolting Joe DiMaggio could take Marilyn's body after her divorce and lay flowers at it for 20 years, I could bury Daisy and leave a carnation for her from time to time. The grayness around me disappeared, and I felt not sad or happy but like a clean blackboard waiting to be written on. As I made my way back to my car, I noticed two additional mourners a few rows over. One was a woman clad in a somber black dress, her appearance modest and orderly, yet imbued with sorrow. Her long blonde hair was neatly braided, cascading down her back. Beside her stood a young boy, clad in jeans and a loose camouflage jacket, his demeanor trembling. His dark, short hair contrasted with his mother's golden locks. Despite my reluctance to intrude upon their private grief, I approached them from behind and glanced at the memorial plaque, Ryan G. Engert, Sergeant, USMC, September 9, 1990 to September 10, 2022, husband, father, Marine, he will be greatly missed. The insignias of the Silver Star and Purple Heart adorned the plaque. The woman regarded me with apprehension, her striking blue eyes filled with uncertainty. "I apologize," I murmured. "I didn't mean to intrude." Before she could respond, the young boy looked up and uttered, "I miss him so much." His eyes, even bluer than his mother's, conveyed a mixture of longing, seeking solace, and perhaps a silent plea for assistance. It was evident that he must have inherited his father's handsome features. Kneeling down, I reached into my pocket and retrieved a notepad and pen, tools I relied on more frequently than the note function on my phone, and extended them to him. "Here, son, write him a note and share your thoughts. You can roll it up tightly and place it in the crevice beside the marker. I'm certain he'll receive it." He embraced me and accepted the notebook and pen, promptly beginning to write. As I rose to my feet, the mother regarded me with tender and genuine appreciation. In that moment, I heard two soft but distinct chuckles, one feminine and the other masculine, whispered into each of my ears. Then, the female voice softly urged, "Keep your promise." It became clear to me that June would no longer be a dreary month.